Hello and welcome back to the Developing Solutions with Sitecore Print Experience Manager video training series. In this video, we'll be continuing some of the advanced PXM development concepts. So in these videos, we'll be covering workflow. Now, there's really two halves to workflow. There's workflow in the standard traditional Sitecore CMS sense, in that you can use that for content approval and project approval. You have access to the workbox within InDesign through the PXM connector. The same workbox and the same user interface and the same commands and options that you see in Sitecore are available to designers, and that's sort of the standard traditional workflow usage. But you also have workflow as a means of automating, and this can be used in a couple main scenarios. The first is automating PDF output, and so an example use case of this is when you create a new article. For example, when you go through that article approval process, one of those steps post-approval is to actually create a PDF, send that to InDesign server, which then can upload to the Sitecore Media Library. Another example is using automation for PXM project creation. And so we're going to go through a couple examples. One is a simple example where we create a new article and then we create a new PXM project, but then point the data references to that new article. And so the purpose of this is a designer can then open that, make any tweaks necessary, and save that back to the PXM project. And then we'll take that simple concept and blow it out to an advanced concept where instead of creating a new article and a new PXM project based upon that article, we're going to take the earlier examples that we used based upon repeaters. And instead of having a repeater iterate through content and create that project on the fly and send that to InDesign, we're going to have our workflow iterate through the project and use the same logic from the repeater, but instead of doing that on the fly and sending it to the client, we're actually going to have that workflow create individual page and other snippet items within that project. And so we're going to start with a very small project, use those repeaters, and then blow out and have a very large PXM projects with hundreds of pages and content items. And the advantage to that is you can use that for saving each of those elements distinctly back to Sitecore and PXM. So if people are working with a specific article and want to make layout changes, they can do that. And so that's really a few examples around automating. And so we're going to cover each of those. We're going to briefly talk about the standard workflow usage, but then we're going to spend a lot of time around automation scenarios. So for standard workflow usage here, you can see that in your InDesign connector, you have a workbox tab, and the functionality of the workbox tabs is very similar to the functionality that you'd see within Sitecore itself. So for example, you have all the list of workflows that you as a user have access to. Since I'm logged in as an admin here, we can see everything. And then within those workflows, you have content items, which can be actual underlying content items or PXM project elements. Those appear in various states within your workflow. And then from that state, so for example, here we're editing an article. This is in the draft state, and you can choose to submit that, and then that will move that to an awaiting approval state. And so all of these interface elements that you're seeing here within the workbox, that is actually coming direct from that Sitecore workflow. Now, because we're going to be spending a lot of time using that workbox interface within InDesign in a lot of the future examples, I'm not going to spend too much time on that in the simplified example. Now, what we're really going to do is spend more time on automating output, because this is really where a lot of the value from PXM comes from. Now, first and foremost, you need to have installed the dynamic workflow module from Sitecore Marketplace. This is not a requirement, but it does make workflow development a lot easier. And so I like to use this pretty much anytime I'm doing any sort of workflow scenario with PXM. Now that is available on the Sitecore Marketplace. There will be a link here in the bottom of the YouTube video. As well as there's an update package on GitHub, and this enables support for Sitecore 7.5 and 8. As you know, between older versions of Sitecore and newer versions, a lot of the rules engine was changed to be contextual, so you're only seeing rules relevant to what you're doing at the time. And so a lot of the rule actions moved around, and we have an update package that does that. Within that update package that I've put on GitHub, there's also a workflow stub, and that has some of what we're going to use for our workflow automation tasks. And so we're going to look at some simple examples in workflow in this video, and then we'll have another video that does an advanced example. So for our simple example, what we're going to do is we're going to put workflow on the launch Sitecore content article itself. And what that's going to do is that's going to give us some abilities on approval to be able to do two things. First off, we want to give the option to automatically generate a PDF. And second, we want to give the option to create a new PXM project and point the data references for that PXM project to that article that I just created. And these are really a good example of the two ways that PXM typically works with content. In one way, you're doing full automation. It goes, it creates a PDF, done. There's no more user intervention required. In the second way, we're creating a PXM project, and the reason for that is then a designer can go and open that PXM project that was created and make changes to the layout elements on that project if they want to do specific things with regards to sizing and placement of content. It gives that designer the final say in what that output looks like. So we're back here now in Sitecore, and we're in the system workflows section. And if you've installed that package that we did during the earlier training samples install section, you now have a new workflow called Launch Sitecore Article Workflow. And it in turn has a couple of stub items here. So at the awaiting approval section, we've got two options. We can create a PDF, we can create a new PXM project, or we can reject that content, and then that pushes that back to the draft state. Now within Create PDF, we have a stub here, and if we take a look at that, we can see here that we have a number of conditions and a number of actions. And so one of the things that the installation of that stub package did is move these conditions and actions into a point that we can see them here in Sitecore 8. And so we have this rule here, and what we're going to do is we're going to make some new rule actions that will apply here in dynamic workflow that will go and update some references within that project that we're sending to InDesign Server, and then we're going to send that project to InDesign Server. So basically we're doing some data key changes, and so what we're going to do is change the article to the content that is being pushed through the workflow, and that is of course the article, because this workflow will be applied on top of articles. And then the next step that we're going to do is the creation of a project task that we're sending to InDesign Server, which will create that. And we're going to set the location for that to the upload directory to Sitecore. And so the moment that this workflow is executed, it's going to create a new print job. It's going to set the data keys necessary within that print job, and then it's going to create that PDF in the upload, and we'll have that content immediately in the media library. And so we're going to go to Visual Studio now, and we're going to create two new workflow rule actions. Okay, so here in Visual Studio, I'm going to create a new folder and call it Workflow. And I'm going to say Add New Item. Now in this case here, because we're using Sitecore Rocks, we have a new Sitecore section. And if you go to Rules, you will see that we have Rule Actions. And I'm going to call this one Set Workflow Variable. And what this does is this actually creates a Sitecore item at this location as well. Now we do need to move that, and that's fine, but it does do a little bit of the work for us in that it is creating that item here. Now we're going to set this resolve correctly and basically put in some code here. So first things first, we're going to put in a parameter called parameter name. And what this is doing is this is allowing us to set a data key, And when we do that, we're going to actually have that data key propagate within workflow. So we're essentially doing similar to what we do with data keys in PXM projects, is allow that to propagate within the entire workflow, and this gets set as a rule context parameter. And then what this means is that any subsequent workflow rule action can use that parameter, and we're actually going to use that parameter in our next workflow command. So our next step is to actually go to the item in the Sitecore repository that was created by Sitecore rocks at this location. So we'll go to Sitecore System, Settings, Rules, Common Actions, and Set Workflow Variable here. And there's two things that we need to do. So first, it created the item for us, and it gave us the correct class reference, and that's fantastic. The next is to change the text within this, and the text is basically the Microsoft Outlook type view of looking at those rule actions and working with those rule actions. And what we're doing here is we're setting a text type, and the initial text will be parameter, so it will say set parameter to current item workflow action, and parameter name is the actual parameter name that is being passed to our underlying code. So we'll go ahead and we'll save that change. And then the next step is to actually move this action. And so Sitecore Rocks is putting this in a location that works well for older versions of Sitecore. We need to move this to somewhere where Sitecore 8 can find it. And so we will move this to our dynamic workflow module here. And so if we now go down to our workflow that we had created, our launch Sitecore article workflow, there's our create PDF action, and we're going to edit this rule to add this specific dynamic workflow command. So we're going to say set parameter to current item, and the parameter is going to be the article, and that is our data key name. And so we'll say OK for that, and we'll do the same for our create PXM project rule as well. So that's the first step. And then the next step for our create PDF action is to actually create the rule action that kicks off that PDF generation process. So for that, we'll go back to Visual Studio. So back here in workflow, we're going to add another new item, and same as last time, we're going to go under the Sitecore section and say rules and rule action, and this will be called workflow auto print InDesign. And then within this, there are a couple parameters that we're going to need to receive from the workflow rule that we're setting in Sitecore. So the first is the project ID. So we need to point to an existing PXM project essentially as a template. And then the next is if we wanted to set any particular file name. And in this case, this is really the file path. So we're saying in our rule, here's where I want you to create that file. And then within that, we're actually going to do some auto naming here. So go and grab the rest of my code. And what are we doing here? Well, we need to create a new Print Studio Publishing Engine print options. And there's a number of things within print options here. So the first one is the print export type. And you can use this to create a number of things that you're sending to InDesign Server. You can create a Flash file that really just gives a very simple kind of flipbook viewer of the pages. You can create JPEGs. This is useful for creating a preview. So let's say you've outputted a report. You want to create a preview for that. Well, you would create a JPEG and a PDF. In our case here, we just want to create the PDF. Now we're naming it based upon the path that we're receiving from our file name parameter, and we're going to give the item name and underscore and item language. And this is obviously something that you can customize. It's very common to use things like GUIDs, so that way when you're creating an article, your generated PDF from that article is going to have the same GUID. And why is that useful instead of item name? Well, item names can change, GUIDs don't. And so that way you can create a new article and have this association really implicit. So when you're looking up, okay, I've got my Sitecore article item, where is that PDF that's created from it? Well, it was named the same as that GUID. So we'll do a few other resolutions here. And that's it. So we're creating PDF. This is what our naming is. This is going on the website. It's going to be uploaded to the media manager eventually, so we don't want to use the high-res version, so that's set to false. And then the last thing, this is really key, is the parameters. So PXM itself has the ability to easily natively get and set parameters. Workflow has the ability to get and set parameters. So our previous workflow rule action set the parameter, which is to say, right, what is the data key that I'm setting? Okay, I'm setting the article data key. I'm passing that into my workflow parameters. And then from my workflow parameters, I can just read that into my print manager parameters and just take that. And the print manager takes those parameters and it sets those data keys appropriately. And so we invoke a new print manager and we choose to print that, and it's creating that file and uploading it. Now, what we're doing here in our rule action is we're just setting the base information, essentially. The actual path where we pick the Sitecore upload directory, we're going to set in our rule action itself. And so for that, again, we go back to Sitecore to finish setting up that actual rule action item. And then, of course, we'll do a compile, and then we'll test this all together. So we're back here in Sitecore, and we're going to go to our rule action, which was added here. And again, we're going to set this text here to basically allow us to receive that project ID and that file name as parameters. So we'll save that, and then we will move this to the rule definitions and the elements and dynamic workflow, and that's where that's being moved to. So last thing before we test this, there's two other things we need to do. The first is to publish this out. So this workflow information right now just exists in the master database. This needs to exist in the web database as well. So we're going to publish out our two new workflow rule actions. Secondly, we'll go to our workflow itself, make that last change. So we're going to add a new rule action. And so here we have our print project to InDesign and save file to path. So our project is this. We want to use our launch Sitecore article. So that's that single article. And we want to save to an existing path. And that is the path. And we will say OK and save that, and make sure that in our case here, let's publish out the entire workflow, because after the upload, we're not necessarily sure if we publish that out. So let's do the entire workflow as well as the sub items. And then that way we know that the workflow is there to be used. And the last thing is we want to apply the workflow as the standard workflow on our launch Sitecore articles. So we'll go to our standard values and go up to review and click on initial. And if you haven't already, make sure that you select the launch Sitecore article workflow here. And so we've done that, save that, and we're going to go up here, and within our articles section, we're going to create a new test article and see if that workflow got kicked off. Now you'll notice that in that stub workflow, we did have a out-of-the-box logging command. And so if this doesn't work, there's two ways to test it. First, make sure your workflow is actually called. Sometimes you're not applying it correctly. Workflow is somewhat tricky, as you probably know in Sitecore. So let's make sure, one, our workflow is actually being called. There are a number of places that could be an issue. It might not be applied on the item successfully. You might have applied it on the item and not standard values. Workflow itself may not have been published. Any of the commands within workflow may not have been published. So there's a number of areas where the workflow could trip up, and that's why we have that logging command in there. But assuming the logging command has executed, then it should get to our steps and our custom steps, which will kick that off. So we go back to Visual Studio itself, and we will do a build. And then the next time we create a new article, those should all kick off, and so we're going to test that now. Okay, so first things first, underneath one of my article groups, we've also been calling them chapters. I'm going to create a new article, and I'm going to call this Launch Sitecore Article Test. Now, a few things I need to do here. I need to put some text in the abstract. So all right, so we've got some abstract text. We have some body text here. Once again, we have to use the editor. I'm going to apply some styling to make sure that comes across. And last, I'm going to set an author. So I'll pick Chris Castle here and save that. And that's about it. So I've got my article here, and all I need to do now is push that through workflow. So we're getting this indication here, this information message, since we put workflow on all articles that are being created. So we'll go to the review tab and kick off that submit process, and we will kick off the create PDF button. And say OK. And so now if we scroll down to our media library here, we should have a new article here called Launch Sitecore Article Test. And I can click on that and download that. And we now have all the information. So we know our renderers are working, our custom renderers, which pull the author from that article field. We have our abstract, we have our H1, we're checking the fonts are there correctly, and we have our regular body text. And so that's really everything, and that's all you need to do for simple PDF generation, is basically invoke the print manager, and all the parameters that we're adding to our workflow as we go along come to the print manager as PXM parameters, which is very convenient. So we can set data keys and use those data keys, in this case, passing that newly created article item to that article data key, and we're receiving that and basically sending that to create that new PDF. So now that we've got this simple PDF creator, we're now going to change this and use some of the same logic, and we're actually going to use the set workflow variable again. But in this case here, instead of taking that variable and sending that all to InDesign server to make a PDF, we're going to take that variable and we're going to expand out and basically update the item references in that PXM project on the fly. So we now have a new PXM project being created, and everywhere that we have that article data key, we're going to take that and set the item reference manually, and then also set the item reference of the children of that snippet manually. And that's another really common scenario. And in this case, what this means is that instead of creating a PDF, we're actually going to create a new PXM project so that an InDesign designer can open that and make changes to that as necessary. So back in Visual Studio, and we're going to go through that same process. We're going to create a new item. This is, again, Sitecore rules rule action. Once again, if you're not seeing this here, it's because you don't have Sitecore rocks installed and you haven't linked up your Launch Sitecore project with that Sitecore installation. So all these things need to be in place in order for Sitecore Rocks to talk to your Sitecore installation and create that rule action. So I'm going to call this build PXM project and say add. And then at this point here, once again, we'll resolve that and we'll start to set some variables. So first things first, we do want to receive the project ID as a variable. And what is the project ID? Well, that will be an existing PXM project that we're taking as a template. So we're going to take our launch Sitecore article PXM project as a template, and we're going to make a copy of it. And then we're going to set all those item references manually from that data key that we're using. And so we'll resolve all this stuff correctly. And we have a couple other functions here that we're going to create. And we add references to link. And at this point, this should be everything. So let's run through quickly what we're getting here. So we now have this new rule action build PXM project. We're going to receive a project ID. Now we're already receiving parameters from the workflow. And so we'll receive that. And basically, we're going to go through key value pairs. You can have a number of data keys set. In our case here, we're just simply setting one data key, and that is the article, and the source of that article is the article item. And so in this case here, we could be iterating through a lot of data keys. In our case, we're just iterating through one. But given that you can iterate through multiple ones, this is basically a loop. And then we go through and we're going to find every reference where we have an item reference field name. And then we're going to go through those and basically update all of the snippets. And so if we look here in our actual project itself, so we'll go to our Print Studio project. Basically what we're doing is programmatically looking at our launch Sitecore article and going down to the snippet level. So we're finding all the snippets. And for each snippet, we need to have a data key, and we're basically finding every time a data key is set. If the data key matches that parameter that we received in our previous workflow step, then we're going to go through and update the item reference to the content that's actually going through that workflow item. And so in that case here, I'm going to create a new article, and that item reference is going to get set to that new article. Now, you need to set that on the snippet. You also need to set that on child items of that snippet as well. And so there's a number of loops here. First is looping through all the key value pairs that you may have set. So all those parameters, in our case, it's just one. We're replacing the articles. And then when you get to a snippet, looping through all the children of that snippet in order to set the item reference correctly as well. And so that's really what's happening here in this code. As before, we're going to go to Sitecore itself and update the actual rule in the settings. And then after that, we're going to compile that, and we'll move this item into the correct and appropriate location. So we'll set that. We're basically allowing the user, we're popping up a tree list selector dialog. The text is project. We're setting that variable project ID. So we'll save that, and we will again move this to the location that is appropriate for Sitecore 8. So that is the definitions and elements and under dynamic workflow with everything else. and save that. And last, in our workflow itself, we're going to modify our create PXM project, and we set that data key earlier, but now we're going to say build a new PXM project based upon an existing project, which is our launch Sitecore article, and say OK, and we'll save that and we'll publish that change out, and we will give this a test right now. So once we've compiled that code, we can basically go back to our article that we created, and I'm going to make a new version, and what this allows is the ability to kick off workflow again easily. And I'm going to make a really quick change here so that we can see this in place. So I'm going to save that, yes, and I'm going to submit. And at the approval stage, instead of creating a PDF, I'm actually going to say create PXM project and done. And so what that workflow is going to do is kick off that custom rule action. And now if I scroll down to my Print Studio projects, I can see here I have this new project called Launch Sitecore Article Test. And if I go back to InDesign here and refresh, I can load that and load that into InDesign, and we can see here my change is in place. Now the nice thing about this method is that it gives designers a final chance to make any changes. And so the fact is I have my abstract field, both my layout, my presentation here in InDesign as my text frame item, and my underlying content. And as a designer, I can make changes to both of those. So I could choose to make Chris Castle's image much bigger and save that back to my underlying PXM project. And I can choose to change the paragraph style on his name, and I could save that back to that underlying project. And so this is really useful for two reasons. One, it allows designers to make those changes, but two, those changes can be saved back to Sitecore and persisted. And so this is really that nice simple example where we're basically creating a new content item, and the creation of that new content item kicks off that underlying process of creating that PXM project and then pointing that PXM project automatically to that article that we created. And so that's a nice simple workflow example, and we're going to now do in the next video a much more complex workflow example based upon the entire book contents.